Greetings. Greetings. Welcome to the first Washington Space Business Roundtable luncheon of the 2018-2019 season. I'd like to welcome all of you here and thank you for joining us to hear from our wonderful keynote speaker today, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine. But first, I'd like to introduce another featured speaker. I'd like to introduce Lisa Callahan from our sponsor, Lockheed Martin. Lisa Callahan is Vice President and General Manager of the Commercial Civil Space line of business for Lockheed Martin Space. In this role, she is responsible for all aspects of execution and growth for commercial and civil markets in human and robotic deep space exploration, communications, and weather and remote sensing. She's a native of Virginia. She went to Virginia Tech, and in my conversations with her, she expressed to me that she spent her entire career at Lockheed Martin up and down the East Coast, including spending a 2-year stint at Lockheed Martin headquarters before heading out to Colorado in the current position in which she serves. She is a member of the Dean of Engineering Advisory Board, and we are pleased to have Lisa here with us today to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Erin. That was very nice. On behalf of Lockheed Martin, we're excited to be the sponsor here, and I'm personally excited to be able to introduce the NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine. Jim started his federal service as a pilot in the U.S. Navy, flying in combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I actually personally got to experience his passion for flying back earlier this year at Farnborough when he spent a few minutes in our F-35 simulator executing a perfect landing on a carrier.
It was perfect.
Did I mention it was a perfect landing? My favorite part of that time was the folks running the simulation said, Jim, would you like the carrier to be stopped or moving? And he said there is no such thing as a stopped carrier. So it was moving and it was perfect. In 2012, Jim was elected to represent Oklahoma's 1st District, and he also served as the Armed Services Committee, as well as the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. And earlier this year, on April 23rd, he was sworn in as the 13th NASA Administrator. It's now my pleasure to introduce Jim Bridenstine and also to welcome up Jeff Foust, who will be moderating this panel.
Thank you.
Audio setup now. Thank you, Administrator, for joining us. As Lisa mentioned, you've been on the job now for 5 months. How has the job compared to your expectations? You knew a lot about NASA going in. How has that compared to the actual experience of running the organization?
It's been great. So it's been very busy. Of course, a steep learning curve. It's also true that there's no shortage of amazing people at NASA that can help me along the way. A lot of really smart people with very strong opinions, and of course they all want to share them with the new administrator. So it's been a great experience. The travel has been a lot, but that's just because I want to make sure that as the administrator, at this point I've now visited all 10 centers that NASA has. Of course, we've been to the Farnborough Air Show at this point. I've made a trip to Israel, and of course I'm going to the IAC next week. So a lot of travel, but it's been a lot of fun getting to know all the folks at NASA, and I look forward to doing great things with them for the coming years.
All right. And there is a lot going on. And One issue that's come up in the news in the last several weeks is the Soyuz spacecraft on the space station. They found a leak in there about a month ago. An investigation is ongoing, led by Roscosmos. Can you give us an update on the status of that investigation?
Absolutely. So I had a conversation not too long ago with my counterpart at the head of Roscosmos, Dmitry Rogozin, and we had a brief chat about some of the, we'll just say, rumors that were kind of circulating in Russian media, and we talked about the ongoing investigation. Energia was responsible for the investigation. That is not the case anymore. Now it's going to be done internally by Roscosmos. And of course, NASA is getting a lot of that information and participating very heavily in the investigation as well. Know this, that the space station is currently safe for operations, that the leak has been repaired, and now we're just doing an investigation to find out what actually caused it. And of course, as soon as we are ready, we want to make sure we make that available to the public.
There's a Soyuz scheduled for launch next month to be carrying a NASA astronaut. You're planning to go to the launch site to observe that. Any questions, any doubts about the safety of that Soyuz leading up to that launch?
No. The flight readiness review is complete, and our rocket scientists have signed off on it, is being ready to go, and I'm anticipating being there. So I'm looking forward to it, and it should be a good launch.
This incident gave you sort of the first opportunity to talk with your Russian counterpart, the head of Roscosmos, Dmitry Rogozin. Rogozin has in the past said some critical things about the U.S.-Russian space relationship. How would you characterize your relationships with him and your plans going forward to work with him?
So at this point, we've had one conversation on the telephone, and it was very positive. He comes from the Russian Duma, and I, of course, come from the U.S. Congress, so we have that kind of background, similarity. We had a good chat about that and our common backgrounds. It's also true that representing constituents in a legislative body is very different than leading a space agency, and so he and I both had a conversation about that. Some of his language, as you mentioned, has historically been aggressive about the United States. Some of my language, as you are aware, has been aggressive about activities of Russia. So here we have really two former members of parliament from their countries that are coming together as the heads of space agencies to figure out how do we keep this very good relationship going, and try to make sure that it doesn't get entangled with all of the other challenges that we have terrestrially. And I really believe that's an important part of America's foreign policy. We've been able to make sure that space is set apart from all of these sometimes terrestrial challenges that we have with our international partners, especially in this case Russia. So it is my intent to keep that relationship strong. It's his intent as well. We had that conversation. And I'm looking forward to getting out to Russia, seeing him face to face, and building that relationship even further.
Just this weekend, he gave some comments suggesting that Russia might think twice about participating in the Lunar Gateway program. Have you heard anything from him or others in Russia that suggests some doubts about being a partner?
I have not, but certainly, the Gateway is in its formative days right now, and certainly we want all partners, and we would welcome a partnership from Russia. But everybody right now is assessing their agencies and the direction that the United States is going and what they want to be a part of. And I will tell you that I have not heard anybody at this point, including Russia, indicate that they did not want to be part of our activities to get back to the surface of the moon.
And speaking of international partners, you're going to be in Germany next week at the International Astronomical Congress, which is one of the leading international space conferences of the year. What sort of message are you going to present there at the meeting, and what sort of activities, meetings do you have planned with potential partners in the Gateway or other international space activities?
Great question. So when you think about the President's Space Policy Directive 1, we're going back to the moon. And in that space policy directive, the president says we're gonna go with international partners, and we're gonna go with commercial partners, and we're gonna have a sustainable architecture. We want a sustainable architecture to get back and forth to the surface of the moon. So in order for it to be sustainable, given our current budgets, we have to make sure that we take advantage of these partnerships. And what I'd like to do is head out to the IAC and share with them our vision for getting back to the surface of the moon, and then where it's appropriate, have these partnerships develop. The architecture, we want it to be open. If there's a country out there that wants to build landers, we want them to build landers that work with the gateway. If there's a country out there that wants to build tugs that go back and forth from Earth orbit to lunar orbit, we want those tugs to work with the gateway. So we want to build an open architecture capability so that international partners and commercial partners can join us in this effort to get back to the surface of the moon. And when I go out there, that's the message I'm going to take. So far, what I've heard from most space, and pretty much every space agency that I've met with face-to-face, they've all said the same thing. We know you're going to the moon. We want to be a part of it. Let us know how we can help, and we'll go sell our governments. I've heard that over and over again, and that's a very strong position for the United States to be in.
Are you expecting to make any particular announcements about international partnerships with the Gateway in particular at IAC next week, or otherwise in the near future?
Maybe not with the Gateway in particular, but certainly there will be other announcements.
And in terms of the Gateway in general, this has turned into the focus point for NASA's exploration plans, human exploration plans beyond Earth orbit. There's a BAA on the street right now for the first element of the Gateway, the power and propulsion element. How is the rest of the Gateway taking shape in terms of who will provide what elements and on what schedule?
You're really trying to make me make news here, aren't you?
I am.
So number one, yes, the power and propulsion element, we now have a BAA out there, and of course we're going to get the best advice from industry, both our traditional partners and commercial partners and everybody in between. We want to see everything that's out there and available to us, and that's why we did the BAA. That being said, the architecture that's being developed, we're going to be assessing capabilities from a whole host of different companies across the United States and, in fact, international partners to determine who can provide what, and we're going to make assessments. So all that is in development right now, and I'm not at this juncture willing to step out and say who's where in the process.
All right, had to try.
Yeah.
Another area of international cooperation is the International Space Station. And the NASA budget request earlier this year talked about plans to end direct federal funding of the ISS in the mid-2020s as part of a transition to commercial capabilities. There's been some pushback, some efforts in Congress to extend the ISS perhaps out to as late as the end of the next decade. If that happens, what effect does that have on NASA's exploration plans if you're continuing to operate the ISS in something like its current state through the end of the next decade?
So you just hit the nail on the head. The idea of ending direct funding for the International Space Station is not just because we want to end direct funding for the International Space Station. It's because the government has been providing support to activities in low Earth orbit now for 20 years. And in fact, the International Space Station has been there for 18 years. And so what we need to do is we need to figure out, how does NASA go further? And if we want to stay in low Earth orbit for the next 20 years, then we shouldn't change anything. But if we want to go further, if we want to go back to the surface of the moon with a sustainable architecture that includes human activities, robotic activities, landers, if we want to take that architecture and apply it to Mars, we ultimately can't keep doing what we've been doing for the last 20 years. All that being said, I have to be really clear with this as well. We do not want a gap in human activity in low Earth orbit. And we are not going to have a gap in human activity in low Earth orbit. So in order to make sure that stays true, we have to start today thinking about where we're going to be 7 years from now. And so we have to think about, how do we commercialize low Earth orbit? How does NASA become one customer of many customers, driving down our cost of access for humans to low Earth orbit? And how do we have multiple providers that are all competing on cost and innovation, enabling us to do more than ever before in low Earth orbit? How do we make that a reality so that ultimately, when we are one customer of many customers and we've got a commercial marketplace that's competitive, driving down costs and increasing access, then we can say we can use NASA's resources to do what NASA ought to be doing, which is pushing the edge of the envelope, going further, going to the moon, and going on to Mars. But the reality is, if we can extend the International Space Station, and if Congress wants to give us a lot more money, we'll take it. But the reality is, given our current budget constraints, we want to go to the moon and we want to go to Mars. We need to commercialize low Earth orbit and go on to the next step. And by the way, that can be done.
Mm-hmm. And what is that? How is that going to take shape over the next year or two? You've got some studies ongoing, I know, for example. But what is the process to either commercialize the space station or transfer capabilities to propose, but as yet unbuilt and unfunded commercial space stations?
So we're looking, as you mentioned, we've got studies that are underway right now to determine how people would propose commercializing low Earth orbit so that NASA is one customer of many customers. As you can imagine, you could have an international consortia of companies that would be interested in operating the International Space Station. And of course, attempting to make the business case close so that would be an opportunity. So there are some people out there, some companies. Again, it would be international because it is the International Space Station, so it would have to be an international consortium of companies. But then there's other ways to commercialize low Earth orbit with human activity, which is having standalone space stations that are, privately funded and launched and put into orbit, and then NASA is one customer of many customers on those new habitation capabilities. So. But we're looking at those studies, and then based on those studies, we'll make assessments for the future.
And another aspect of commercialization is the Commercial Crew Program. You announced last month the astronauts who are going to be flying on the initial test flights and initial crew rotation missions coming up. How confident are you that the companies can stick to the schedules that were announced last month and have those test flights done by the middle of next year?
I'm very confident that we can stick to those schedules. I want to be really clear that those schedules are really, it's not NASA's schedule, it's our commercial crew partners that are working to make sure that we have all of the safety mechanisms in place. What we're doing here is unique and it's different. We have not launched humans on rockets since the retirement of the space shuttles in 2011. And this is an important capability for the United States of America. There's no margin for error. We cannot have any kind of failure here. And so at the end of the day, we've got to get it right. It's important that we take our time to get it right. And then we can have a better partnership with Russia. We've been dependent on Russia since 2011 to launch our astronauts to the International Space Station. And now we want to have a mutually beneficial relationship where we're not dependent on them, but we can launch on their rockets and they can launch on ours. So it's important for us to get it right.
And what's Plan B if there are further delays because access to Soyuz seats runs out around the end of next year or the beginning of 2020?
Yeah, so January of 2020 is when we're going to run out of Soyuz rocket launches. There are a couple of things that can be done. Number one, we have 2 commercial crew providers. And I think that's an important, when they developed this capability, they intentionally wanted multiple providers with dissimilar designs so that if one is not ready, the other one could be ready. So we've got redundancy built into the system already. It's also true that those first flights, when we talk about the test flights to the International Space Station with crew, those first flights are not intended to be long duration stays at the International Space Station. Just test the docking, be there for a few days, and come back home. If necessary, if we needed if those test flights get pushed back to January of 2020, which we do not anticipate, but if that were to happen, we could actually make those missions stay longer, so that we could, those test flights would then become more operational yet still test flights. So that's in the realm of opportunity, but I don't think that we're going to have to do that.
All right. At the NASA Advisory Council meeting last month, you announced the formation of a new committee that was going to look at some of the regulatory and policy issues. And one of the topics you suggested for the committee was the idea of sponsorships, commercial sponsorships for NASA launches and NASA missions. And that got some belated media attention in a couple of weeks afterwards like that. What's the importance of having, a commercial sponsor for a NASA mission?
I think that's funny that you said belated media attention. Because you're right, it seemingly was a non-issue, and then all of a sudden there are a couple of news outlets that kind of made a big deal out of it. But the reality is we need to commercialize low Earth orbit. I mean, that's the objective. And the other thing that's important to remember, with commercial crew, we, NASA, these are not NASA's owned and operated rockets. These rockets belong to our commercial crew partners. We are buying a service, and that's true for commercial resupply, and it's true for commercial crew. We are buying a service. That means they own and operate their rockets. So the question then becomes, could they get a sponsorship and I don't know what that sponsorship might look like, but there are companies that might be interested in co-branding with one of these rocket companies, and the question is, should NASA stop that from happening? And the answer is no. The goal is for us to be one customer of many customers, and some of those customers might be non-traditional in nature. They might be customers that we don't think of every day. In fact, they might be customers that have nothing to do with space whatsoever, but they want to co-brand with a mission that's going to resupply the International Space Station. And when I say co-brand, again, it's not our rocket. It belongs to somebody else. And so if they put a little bit of paint on a rocket and drive down our cost by $10 million, why would we not allow our commercial partners to do that? So that's one aspect. The other aspect would be there are people out there who have suggested that we should have sponsorships on the International Space Station. And again, I have not recommended that we do this. I'm not suggesting that we do it. What I've asked the NAC to do is to consider what the realm of possibility is given our authorities and have them make a recommendation, not can we do it, but if we can do it, should we do it? And I don't know what the right answer is, but that's what I've asked the NAC to consider. If you remember, it wasn't too long ago, was Pizza Hut sponsored a, which was it a Proton
launch?
Yeah, they sponsored a Proton launch. And I don't know what they paid for that or what the cost offset was for the Russian Space Agency. But here's the other thing that's important to know. And the International Space Station has been and will continue doing it. We will continue doing this. There's a lot of commercial companies that are operating on the International Space Station right now, and their intent is to retire risk so that one day they might be able to go forward and make a profit. And that's true for in-space manufacturing. It's true for the 3D printing of human organs using adult stem cells in a microgravity environment. It's true for pharmaceuticals. There's all sorts of commercial activities happening on the International Space Station where we're partnering with commercial industry to retire risk so that one day they might be able to make a profit. So the question then becomes, what about some of these non-traditional kind of commercial capabilities? Should we not entertain that as well? And in my view, we should look at it. I'm not saying what we ought to do, but certainly let's take a look at it. And so, from a commercial crew and commercial resupply perspective, I don't think we should be telling our suppliers what they should or should not put on their rocket. And then when it comes to NASA's role, one of the reasons we might consider these kind of activities is because it proves a market. And if we can prove that there's a market for this kind of activity, then our commercial providers can go raise money from capital markets and demonstrate that this might be one step in closing their business case. So again, I'm not saying what the right answer here is. I'm saying that we're living in a new era in space flight, and we need to consider all the options.
All right. I'd be remiss in not asking sort of the hot topic in space policy this summer, which has not had anything to do directly with NASA, but is, of course, the announcement of plans to create a Space Force. And you've made clear in a number of comments that Space Force is separate from NASA. But you've also been sort of, I think, one of the leading advocates talking up the importance of a Space Force, more so perhaps even than some of the people in the Pentagon. Are you concerned that by advocating for a Space Force, you may be blurring the lines between military and civil activities?
Not at all. I think everybody should be advocating for a Space Force. It's, you know, the reality is space has transformed our condition on Earth. The way we communicate, the way we navigate, the way we produce food, the way we produce energy, the way we do disaster relief, national security, banking, the way we manage flows of electricity on the power grid. All of this depends on space-based activities. So when we lose access to space, it's an existential threat to the United States of America. That's just the reality. Now, does NASA get involved in national security and defense? No, and we're not going to. That's not our intent here. The question is, do we have hundreds of billions of dollars worth of assets in space that could be under threat? Yes. Do we have humans? We're the only agency in the federal government that has humans in space. Do they need to be protected? Absolutely. Space, in my view, is a domain of warfare, not because we want it to be, but because there are countries out there, namely China, that's calling space the American Achilles heel, because they know that it is an existential threat to the United States of America. So the question is, what is our response? And you think about what a Space Force is and what a Space Force does. All a Space Force would do is organize, train, and equip a cadre of professionals that can then be deployed to the combatant commands for warfighting capabilities. Now, all of that already exists inside Air Force Space Command. So when you think about, you know, the Space Force, it's not something that should take a whole lot of time or a whole lot of money. We're talking about really a capability that already resides inside the Air Force. The difference is it has to compete with the Air Force for capabilities in the air domain or in the cyber domain. And in my view, it ought to be separate. And by the way, I feel like I can talk about this quite freely because I was in the House of Representatives and I voted for it 3 times in the House of Representatives. The first time on the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, the second time on the Armed Services Committee, the third time it was in the National Defense Authorization Act. And each time it passed with broad bipartisan support. And when it was in the NDAA, it got 344 votes in the House of Representatives. Of course, it went over to the Senate, and that was the end of it. But it passed with broad bipartisan support in the House. All that being said, if you look at what the Vice President has laid out, Chairman of the National Space Council, if you look at what the DoD has laid out, they talk about a Space Operations Force which manages that organize, train, and equip function. They talk about a new combatant command. You know, those are the military services don't fight wars. All they do is organize, train, and equip. It's the combatant commands that fight wars. And they do have in the program a new combatant command, the U.S. Space Command, which, by the way, we had back in the 1980s. I think in the early 90s it got rolled into Air Force Space Command. But we did have a combatant command. And bringing that combatant command back that is focused not on, you know, a geography on Earth, but focused on a function, that being space security, I think is important. So a military service, a functional combatant command, and of course, you know, an Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space, which you add all that together and it looks a lot like a Space Force. And that's what the Vice President you know, suggested that we do at his Pentagon speech a number of weeks ago.
All right. I've got some more questions, but I suspect some people in the audience have some better questions. So if you've got a question, raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. Lance, up front. Reminder, just keep the question short and in the form of a question.
I'm Lance Bush, President and CEO of John Anderson.
Yes, sir. Good to see you.
Yeah, so this is a softball question for you.
Okay. I like softballs.
Yeah, so you're
You're not supposed to tell them it's a softball.
It wasn't planted. This is you are the leader of this space community, which is an inspiration to a lot of young people, and you're a parent. Could you share with all of us your thoughts on STEM, the importance to STEM education of NASA and where you see it going?
That's a great question. Sally was just commenting earlier that I've been an attendee of the Washington Space Business Roundtable going back to probably 2013 when I first came to Congress. And I've been an attendee here for a lot of reasons, because of the committees that I sat on, and of course trying to understand the community better and get to know what the interests were within this community. But another reason I have always believed that this organization is important is because of their focus on STEM. You know, science, technology, engineering, and math. Critically important for young people in this country today for our capabilities going forward. You think about, you know, if you want to think about who controls power on the planet, it's who controls the technology. That means we have to have the absolute best scientists, the absolute best engineers, the absolute best technologists. NASA has a lot of those capabilities resident inside NASA. The question is, how do we make sure that 30 years from now, 50 years from now, we've got the talent then that we have now? And the answer is organizations like this, organizations like the Challenger Center that are focused on STEM are going to help build up that cadre of talent. It is, when I was a young kid, after the summer after my 5th grade year, I had the opportunity to participate in a wind tunnel. It was a summer camp. My mom put me in a summer camp, probably because she wanted me out of the house. And in this summer camp, I played with a wind tunnel at the University of Texas at Arlington for a week. And I got to change the camber of a wing. I got to see the effects on lift and drag and all those things when you change the shape of a wing. I learned about Bernoulli's theory and all of these kind of things as a 5th grader going into 6th grade. And from that point forward, I knew that what I'm going to do with the rest of my life, I'm going to be a pilot. I just knew that. And that was a pivotal moment. Later in my life, after being a Navy pilot, and I ran the Tulsa Air and Space Museum, and I got to see firsthand, we had events similar to kids playing with a wind tunnel. We had all kinds of STEM engagement activities for young kids. And I got to see firsthand the lives of children be changed. And I know that a lot of those kids, when they get older, they're going to make decisions to go into the STEM fields because of the experience they had at the Tulsa Air and Space Museum. So whether it's the Washington Space Business Roundtable, the Challenger Center, Tulsa Air and Space Museum, these are the kind of things, the activities that get that next generation inspired. Because again, the balance of power on Earth is dependent on who controls the technology. And we've got to make sure that we're raising up the next generation of technologists so that it's on our side and not somebody else's. So it's an important mission for this organization and so many others. And NASA, here's what's unique about NASA. Sorry. If you want to clap, you can clap. But what's unique about NASA is that we have this ability, unlike any other federal entity, we have the ability to create those moments in time where people say, wow, that's what I want to do with my life. You go down to the NASA headquarters and you talk to the people there that are old enough, they remember exactly where they were when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon. And because of that, they work at NASA. And they're scientists and they're engineers. We need to create more of those stunning achievements that get the next generation enthused. And if we do that, we're going to be just fine. This is conversely, that was the summer after my 5th grade year. You know what happened during my 5th grade year? Challenger, right? So I have this vision in my head of where I was during that unfortunate, experience. We need to create those kind of images that are positive. And we haven't done that in a while, but we're going to do that. That's why we're going back to the moon. It's a big piece of the reason. But anyway, that's a great question. Fully support NASA's role in STEM engagement.
All right. Looks like a question midway back there.
Hi, Laura Delgado Lopez with Harris. Administrator, you talked about the importance of the weather mission, and I'm wondering if you can comment on the health of NASA's relationship with NOAA and what you're doing in your current role to ensure we have the weather capabilities we need.
That's a great question. So just so you're aware, NASA's relationship with NOAA is strong. We build NOAA satellites, which is important, GOES, JPSS. But there's one major shortcoming right now in this relationship. One shortcoming that's more important than pretty much anything else that we're dealing with. And that is, we don't have a NOAA administrator. Barry, you're here. I'm going to dime you out if that's all right. Will you stand up? So Barry, yeah, please give Barry a round of applause. Barry was nominated 11 months ago to be the NOAA administrator. And he's one of so many people that have been caught up in this political gridlock. This is not a controversial kind of issue. I mean, we're talking about a NOAA administrator. We need to get a NOAA administrator confirmed. It's important for our country. We've got hurricanes that are making landfall. We're in the middle of hurricane season. There are tropical storms being formed right now. And there are new ways today to get more data and better data than ever before because of the commercialization of space and the commercialization of data. I just, I was very involved, and Barry helped me write the weather bill that we passed in the House and the Senate, signed by the President, signed by President Obama. It was a comprehensive weather reform bill. Signed by President Trump, but it was a comprehensive weather reform bill that ultimately is going to save lives and property in the long term. Well, we need a NOAA administrator that can implement it and take advantage of all the new capabilities that we have in space, ultimately to save lives and property. So this is an important thing for the agency. It's an important thing for NOAA, and this is one example of so many others. But this is a high-profile one right now in the middle of hurricane season.
All right. Anything else from the audience?
By the way, that was a great question. That was not set up, by the way. I wanted to dime out Barry, though. Thank you.
So we've talked about human exploration, we talked about weather. I would be remiss in not bringing up planetary.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of very impressive milestones coming up this fall. I think Lori Clay has referred to it as the season of science. So can you talk a little bit about what we're going to see going into the end of the year with the planetary missions?
Yeah, great question. So the one thing I think I'm probably most looking for, well, there's a couple of things. I can't pick one over the other. InSight, we're going to be landing on Mars. Yeah, big deal. We're going to be landing on Mars for the 8th time. We're the only country on the face of the planet that has ever landed on Mars successfully, and now we're going to do it for an 8th time. So knock on wood, everybody. But that's a big deal. I'm going to head out to JPL for that event. It's going to happen the Monday after Thanksgiving. I think it's November 20th, 11 a.m. Put it on your calendars. That's going to be a lot of fun to watch. And of course, what that mission is going to do, it's going to allow us to get a 3D image of the inside of Mars. Help us understand Mars quakes, help us understand meteor impacts, and ultimately help us understand what we need to know so that we can have a human mission to Mars be safe and effective. A couple of things that we now know about Mars, I think that are important. We now know, and this has just happened since I've become the NASA administrator, we now know that there is liquid water 1.5 kilometers under the surface of Mars. And when we get this 3D image from InSight, we're gonna know a lot more about what underneath Mars looks like. We're gonna understand the temperature of Mars and how it's cooling, how it's outgassing. But the InSight mission is going to go a long ways to helping us understand the liquid water composition of Mars. Now that we know that there's liquid water there. So other things come the first of the year. The New Horizons mission is going to be passing a couple of objects in the Kuiper Belt, which is going to be a lot of fun to see. That's going to be on New Year's Day, maybe New Year's Eve. Either way, it's going to be a New Year's celebration, and we're going to, for the first time, see objects. We're actually going to do, in essence, a mission to an object in the Kuiper Belt and receive data from that object and characterize that object. So that's a big deal as well. Planetary missions, just to be clear, are critically important for a balanced portfolio within the NASA Earth Science, or the NASA Science Mission Directorate. We've got to make sure that we balance planetary science with Earth science and astrophysics and heliophysics, and we are. What I've got to make sure I'm careful of is we don't ultimately pit them against each other because they're both doing phenomenal work that can help us understand our planet better. You know, when we learn about Mars, for example, we now understand that, you know, Mars used to have, you know, 3/4 of it was covered by ocean. Mars used to have a strong, you know, magnetosphere, which protected it from radiation, and it used to have a thick atmosphere, and all of that changed a billion plus years ago, and the question is why? And if we can understand that about planets like Mars or planets like Venus, then we can get a better understanding of our own planet and make assessments of the direction that we as a planet are going. So planetary science, earth science, all work together. And the key for me to make sure that we're getting the right balance is to follow the decadal surveys that come from the National Academy of Sciences, which we intend to do. So a lot of exciting things.
All right. Gentleman there.
Hi, sir. Alex Foster at Aerojet Rocketdyne. So you mentioned today's political climate and being a political appointee. How important is it, do you think, for you and for NASA as an agency to separate from the political, you know, scene and everything that's going on? And how do you think the best way to do that is moving forward?
A great question. And what I would tell you is that NASA has strong bipartisan support. Our budget is very healthy. Quite frankly, right now, for the first time in a long time, our budget's going up. A couple of, you know, when I got nominated and before I was confirmed, the president had requested a budget for NASA of $1 billion higher than the previous year. And that had not happened in a long time, $1 billion plus up for NASA. And of course, I was thrilled to hear that. And even before I got confirmed, bipartisan support in the House, bipartisan support in the Senate, they passed an omnibus that plussed up NASA $1.7 billion. So when your agency is $19 billion and you go up $1.7 billion, that's a big plus up, and it demonstrates strong bipartisan support. And so that's all very healthy for NASA. Of course, I would welcome more. And I say that in jest, but it's true. We talk about how space has transformed the human condition on Earth. You know, as I said before, with the way we produce food and energy and communication, navigation, all of those things, it has improved the human condition on Earth significantly, and all of that capability is available because of a trail that was blazed by NASA. And yet we're 1/2 of 1% of the federal budget. The economic impact from that 1/2 of 1% of the federal budget is immeasurable. And at the same time, if instead of 1/2 of 1%, if we had a full 1% of the federal budget, you can imagine the impact that we would have going forward. So I don't say that flippantly. I'm being sincere. A lot of times when the government spends money, it's because there's hardship in the world and we're trying to alleviate pain or alleviate hardship. Well, here you have an agency where a small investment increases the awesomeness. And not just increases the awesomeness, but enables activities and job creation in a way where you don't have to alleviate so much hardship because there are so many spin-offs and so many technologies and capabilities that come from that small budget that is NASA. So it's always been a wonderful investment for the United States of America. As far as remaining bipartisan or nonpartisan, we've had a lot of success there. As I said, our budgets are going up in a bipartisan way. We're following the decadal surveys from the National Academy of Sciences. That, of course, helps it maintain its apolitical status. What I have found is that you know, the areas that become political are generally not necessarily political, but some people try to spin it that way, specifically regarding Earth science. NASA has always studied the Earth. It's in the 1958 law that created NASA. We're going to continue studying the Earth. And I will tell you, on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats alike want to know what's happening to the planet. Everybody wants to know what's happening to the planet. They can disagree on what to do about what we learn, but that's not what NASA does. NASA does the science. NASA does dispassionate science and provides the information to policymakers that can then make those kinds of decisions. NASA is not going to drive the policy decisions that come from the science. All that being said, that there has been some argument about Republicans want to go to the moon and Democrats want to go to Mars, and how can that become political? I don't know. But the truth is, we need to go to the moon to prove the capabilities and technologies to retire the risk, and then take all of that and apply it to Mars. The moon is our path to Mars. They're not exclusive of each other. They're inclusive of each other. So I would say, we're in great shape right now from a bipartisan perspective, and I'm thrilled to be able to say that.
Great. Maybe one more question.
Good evening. Good afternoon. My name is Thurman Jones, the Patriots Technology Training Center. First of all, I'd like to thank the Washington Space Business Roundtable for sponsoring our STEM program. Our STEM program, Patriots Technology. For the last 8 years, we've been hosting a solar system competition at NASA Ghana. And the Washington Space Business Roundtable has sponsored the winning team to Space Camp in Huntsville, Alabama. So once again, I want to thank everyone, and also being judges at the competition. So my question to you, sir, is what are some of the outreach programs you think that the Space Center should do in the community to get more students involved with NASA?
Great question. So we're going through right now a year of education, and we're using the International Space Station and downlinks from the International Space Station direct to classrooms all over the country, in fact all over the world, to get that next generation of student engaged in STEM activities. And so they're doing, on the International Space Station, I think they're averaging about 1 downlink to a classroom a day. And in some cases, they're doing 2 or more a day. So that's a very positive development. The other thing we have that's tremendously advantageous is this amazing cadre of either retired astronauts or active astronauts that are not flying in the immediate future. And we're deploying them to classrooms all over the country and getting them to engage students. But I think the one thing we can do more than anything else is accomplish that stunning achievement. We have to have that one kind of bright, shiny moment where people can see, wow, that's what NASA just did. New Horizons was one of those when it flew by Pluto, and we got the first images in human history of Pluto, which of course people had envisioned, they had their own ideas on Pluto for years, and now we see it for the first time for real, and we're able to make not guesses, but actually have real data on what Pluto is. That was one of those times when NASA was on the cover of every newspaper in the country and every newspaper around the world. And the more of those kind of capabilities that we do, the more of those stunning achievements that we're able to accomplish, the more we're going to get that next generation engaged in STEM activities.
Just wanted to close with this. A week from today is a historic day. October 1st, besides being the beginning of a new fiscal year, is the 60th anniversary of NASA beginning operations. I know a week ago you shared the stage with 5 of your predecessors as NASA Administrator. Just curious, what advice did NASA's past give you to help guide the agency's future?
That's another wonderful question. You think back to how NASA got created and the capabilities and technologies that have come from it, and ultimately the balance of power on Earth. There was a day when the entire world perceived that the United States of America was behind the Soviet Union. Like we were technologically inferior and not catching up, and therefore our political and economic system correspondingly was not able to measure up to the Soviet system at the time. And of course that was a real problem. And from that, President Eisenhower said we're going to do something different. He did not want our human spaceflight activities, our space exploration activities, to be resident inside the Department of Defense or inside the military. He intentionally wanted to create a civil organization that was separate from the military apparatus. That's why he created NASA in 1958. It was a proposal from him to Congress that he delivered in a special session, a joint session of the House and the Senate in a special session. It wasn't a State of the Union, it was a special session, and he, in that special session, said, here's what we need to do to get ahead of our near-peer competitor, if not the Soviet Union, which is ahead of us. Then we had a new president in John F. Kennedy who suggested that we got to go even faster, even further. And of course, in 1962, he gave a speech to a joint session of Congress declaring that we're going to go to the moon. And at this time, this was only about a week after Alan Shepard had done his straight up and down flight that went across the Kármán line. So a couple hundred miles, 250,000 miles. That's a big difference. And oh, by the way, we're going to land on the surface of the moon and come home. So he declares to the world in a joint session of Congress that we're going to the moon. Then he goes to Rice University, my alma mater. Got to throw that in there. He goes to Rice University and he gives probably one of the greatest orations in American history about why we go to the moon. His speech was called "We Choose to Go to the Moon." And in that speech, he asked the very important question that all of us should be asking ourselves. And that question was this. He asked, why does Rice play Texas? And then he asked another important question, which is, why do you climb the highest mountain? You choose to do these things because they are hard. And he was setting an agenda for the United States. He needed something, if you go back and you read some of the history, he needed an agenda that was sufficiently visionary that there was time to actually get ahead of the Soviet Union. And ultimately, that's what this vision was. In 1962, he's declaring that we're going to go to the moon by the end of the decade, because it was long enough in duration to where it wouldn't be, if you remember, the Soviet Union beat us to that EVA, the extravehicular activity. They beat us in all of these things all along the way, but it was really, the first time we came ahead was really Apollo. Well, we kind of got ahead, and then we had the Apollo 1 setback, but by Apollo 8, the first time we orbited the moon with humans, it was an amazing achievement. When you think about how that happened. We skipped Apollo 2, skipped Apollo 3, we did Apollo 4. Apollo 4 was one of those, it was a test flight and it was successful, but it was the Saturn rocket to low Earth orbit. And then we did Apollo 5 was a lunar lander kind of mission. Apollo 6 was an absolute failure. The rocket pogoed. The second stage, only 3 of the 5 rockets even lit. The upper stage, which was supposed to do our translunar injection, that rocket didn't light at all, and it didn't even achieve the velocity necessary to test the heat shield on the re-entry. So all of this happened on Apollo 6, which was a total failure. It was uncrewed, so nobody got hurt, which is a good thing. Nobody probably would have gotten hurt anyway. But it didn't successfully achieve its objectives. And that was then in August of 1968. And you think back in time, 1968, you've got civil rights protests, you've got, of course, civil rights abuses, you've got the Vietnam War raging, you've got Vietnam War protesters, you've got the assassination of Martin Luther King, you've got the assassination of Robert Kennedy, 1968. A failed year in American history. And in August of that year, NASA decides, after a failure of Apollo 6, they decide in August that we're going to the moon in December. And Apollo 6 didn't even go to the moon. It was just in low Earth orbit, a failure in low Earth orbit. And that was in August. And they said by December we're going to the moon because we're going to achieve ultimately John F. Kennedy's vision of getting to the moon by the end of the decade. And of course, our brave astronauts did what was their country called them to do, and they did things that we believed would potentially, the question Bill Anders' wife asked at the time, I think it was Chris Kraft, the question was, what are the chances that he's going to come home alive? And the answer was 50%. I mean, that's the amount of risk that they were taking. And I'm guessing that he was saying that because it was on the high side. And here's the other thing that's important to know about that story, Apollo 8, 1968. So we're going to be celebrating the anniversary of that on Christmas Eve. So if this mission would have failed, it not only would have changed forever our vision of going to the moon, it would have changed forever Christmas. I mean, imagine having a disaster on Christmas Eve. And of course, when they did have success, at Christmas. That evening, on Christmas Eve, 1968, when they keyed the mic to communicate to the entire world that they were in orbit around the moon and what they were doing, what they were working on, low lunar orbit. So they retro-burned in order to get down into low lunar orbit with one rocket, and the previous test of that rocket on Apollo 6 had failed. So they retro-burned. Now they're in low lunar orbit. They are praying that that rocket is going to relight. Because if it doesn't, they're going to spend the rest of their lives in orbit around the moon. And given their life support, that could probably be about 4 days. And in that low lunar orbit, they key the mic on Christmas Eve. And 1 out of every 4 people on the planet on Christmas Eve listened to that broadcast. That's a stunning achievement. That's the history and the legacy of NASA. And if I can in any way try to measure up to that history and that legacy, that's a tall order. And I'm not suggesting I can. But I'll tell you, it's very humbling to be at the helm of this extremely storied agency.
Well, we wish you and the agency the best of success with all the missions coming up and all the challenges that you face. So thank you very much, Administrator.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Washington Space Business Roundtable, we'd like to present to the NASA Administrator a very ethical cup of candy.
All right.
That you can enjoy in your office. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's my third one.
And thank you also to Jeff Foust for providing a very provocative conversation with the Administrator. Thank you very much for helping. And I'd like to invite you all back to this very same room next month on October 15th, where we will be featuring Blue Origin's Clay Morey to give us an update on Blue's technology and adventures in space exploration as well. So registration should be online very soon if it's not already, Tian. Registration is available, I think, very soon. If not already, it should be up tomorrow. So thank you so much for joining us today.